I'm going to read this morning a very familiar story to you. It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We're going to read from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. We'll read John chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. The title of the message is The Boy Who Said Yes. John writes, "After this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A huge crowd kept following him wherever he went, because they saw his miraculous signs as he healed the sick. And Jesus climbed a hill and sat down with his disciples around him. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, 'Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?' He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, 'Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed them.' Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'There is a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with such a huge crowd?' 'Tell everyone to sit down,' Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterward, he did the same with the fish. They all ate as much as they wanted." The Bible is filled with stories about famous people, heroic people, exceptional people. There's Abraham, the father of 3 different religions. There's Noah, who had enough faith in God to build an ark out in the middle of the desert. There's Moses, the great lawgiver. Esther, the beauty queen whose intelligence and cunning helped save a nation. And then we come to this little boy about whom we know almost nothing. Not even his name is told to us. And so in that sense, it's an unusual story. It's also unusual because the 2 disciples who are mentioned are kind of not from the inner circle of James, John, and Peter. Usually when the disciples are mentioned by name, it's one of those 3 who does something exceptional. But here only Philip and Andrew are mentioned. Philip usually takes the brunt of criticism from commentators and scholars looking at that story. I remember reading Vance Havner's sermon about this passage when I was in seminary, and he was very critical of Philip for his lack of faith. But the older I get, the more I kind of sympathize with Philip a little bit, who, at least he was there. He was trying. But he did have that lack of vision, that lack of faith. And then there's Andrew. He brings the little boy to Jesus. And I love that about Andrew. He's not one of the big disciples, but the few times that he's mentioned in the New Testament, he's bringing someone to Jesus. He was Peter's brother. He brought Peter to Jesus. And here, Andrew is the one who brings this little boy to Jesus. Now, what I want to show you today from this passage, there's a lot here, but where I'm going to focus is this. Do you ever feel overwhelmed in terms of trying to be a blessing to people, to help people? There's so much need in the world today. What can you, as one person, do to help others? What I want to show you from the story this morning is not just what this little boy did, but how he did it. How this little unnamed boy became the fulcrum, the focal point for the miracle that Jesus ended up doing. By the way, this is the only miracle that is recorded by all 4 Gospels other than the resurrection. So clearly this story made an impression on the gospel writer. So how did this little boy become part of this great miracle, the only miracle recorded by all four gospels? Three things I'm going to show you. They'll be easy to remember because they're just one word each. The first one is proximity. The little boy was close to Jesus when Jesus needed him. Now, again, we know almost nothing about this little boy. We don't know his name. He's not mentioned. We don't know why he was there. Maybe his parents were there. I don't know. Maybe they weren't. We don't know his age. In my mind, I picture him being around like 11 or 12, but that's just a guess on my part, a hunch. Fact is, we have no idea how old he was, who he was, why he was there. We only know one thing about him. Well, a couple of things. But what we know at this point is he was close to Jesus when Jesus needed him. Proximity. And the point I want to make to you, the emphasis I want to make to you here is stay close to Jesus. People ask me sometimes, does God still speak to people today? And I believe, yes, he does. I think the question we ought to be asking ourselves is anybody listening? Is anyone close enough to the Lord that when he speaks, you actually hear what he's saying? Don't underestimate the importance of proximity, of just being close to the Lord when he needs you to do something. That's one of the things I pray for. Every day I have a little list of 10 things that I pray for. One of them, the things I pray for myself, I pray that God will help me to just be present in the present. Help me to be sensitive to his leadership. Help me to be sensitive to the needs of people around me. You remember that Isaiah was in the temple worshiping God. He was close to the Lord when the Lord spoke to him and said, Isaiah, you live in the midst of a sinful people. Who's going to go give the good news to those people? And that's when Isaiah said, I'll go. I'm right here. Send me. This little boy was close enough that when Jesus needed somebody to give their lunch, he was there to give it. I like to think of this little boy as well, we don't have patron saints as Baptists, but I like to think of him as the patron saint of ordinary Christians. He was just a nondescript little boy who had almost nothing, but he was close to Jesus when Jesus needed somebody. So that's number one, stay close to Jesus. The little boy didn't have much, but he was close to Jesus when Jesus needed him. Proximity. Number two is opportunity. The need for food was an opportunity for this boy to give what he had, although it wasn't much. Now this is where Philip failed. You notice there in verse 7 of what we read, that it was Philip who said, and the translation I read from doesn't quite, it's more kind of a paraphrase, but most of the translations, Philip actually give, not the amount, but sort of the amount. He tells Jesus, we have 8 months' wages. That's the amount they had in their coffers at that time. So Philip was close to Jesus. He was right there. He saw the need, and he even knew what they had. He went up to Jesus and said, look, we've got 8 months' wages, but what is that compared to such a great need? Philip understood how many people there were. He understood what their resources were. There was one crucial, important thing that Philip didn't understand. He didn't understand that Jesus is the greatest resource in the world. And that's something, he's standing right next to Jesus, and he still didn't realize that the greatest power in the universe was right there. The greatest power of all, the power of God, was standing right next to him, and it went right over Philip's head. Philip knew how many people there were, he knew what their resources were, he just forgot about God. We do that in church all the time. And I don't just mean our church, I mean churches across the world. We make budgets, we make plans, we look at all the opportunities, and then we look at what our resources, and we figure out what we can do and what we can't do. The thing we forget to do is to ask God and to depend on God. I heard W. Criswell telling the story once, and he told it on himself, which I really admire, because he came out as the, the brunt of this story was on him. He said that, he was pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas for almost half a century. And it is a downtown church, which meant that as people started moving out toward the suburbs, he was there from the 40s to the 90s. And that's at the time when people started moving out of downtown and going out to the suburbs. People didn't want to drive back downtown to go to their church because there was no parking. And he knew that eventually that was going to be the death of their church, that there would be no place for people to park because they were downtown, right in the middle of downtown. But there was a parking building, catty corner, across from their church. And he said he could stand in his office and look out at it, and every day he would see it, and he would think, oh, what can we do to get that building? And he would think about all the millionaires they had in their church, people who could afford to buy it. And he would go through his mind, he'd go through the list, well, I could ask this person, or I could ask this person, or maybe we could have a big campaign drive and raise the funds. He went through all of these computations in his mind of how could we do this. And he said one day, he was standing there at the window just looking out, and the door was open to his office as it usually was. And he said the janitor, the church janitor, was walking by, and he stopped, and he looked, and he said, Pastor, excuse me, but I notice every day I walk by and you're just staring out the window. What are you looking at? And he said, oh, well, there's this, our church is going to die because there's no parking around here, and all of our members have moved out to the suburbs, and we need that parking building over there, and I'm trying to figure out how can we get it. And the janitor said, well, Pastor, have you asked God for it? And Criswell said he realized that's the one thing I haven't done. I've thought of every plan under the sun except that one, to ask God for it. And so he said he started praying every day, God, give us that building. And there was a woman in their church who was a multi-millionaire, and one day she wrote a check. She heard somehow through the grapevine, I guess the janitor started telling people, and she heard through the grapevine, and she came to the pastor's office one day, and she pulled out her checkbook, and she said, Pastor, how much is that building? And he told her, I think it was like $6 million, and she wrote a check for it on the spot. See, that's the one thing Philip forgot to do, is to rely on God. Every problem in your life, and I want you to hear this, every problem in your life, without exception, is an opportunity for the power of God to be displayed. Do you understand that? Back when the Roman Empire finally fell, after centuries, the great, powerful Roman Empire finally fell in the year 410. The Visigoths, the pagan, barbarian Visigoths came in and conquered the city of Rome. The church by that time was headquartered in Rome and had been for a century. Two of the great church fathers were alive at that time, Jerome and Augustine. They had two very different reactions to what happened. Jerome, when he saw that the city of Rome had fallen to the pagans, is said to have fallen into despair. And he said, what will become of the church now that Rome has fallen? Augustine, on the other hand, looked at what had happened and he gave thanks to God. And he said, God has brought the mission field to the missionaries. God has brought the pagans here to Rome. And he saw it as a providential opportunity. Every problem is an opportunity for the power of God to be displayed. And this little boy, who was close to Jesus when Jesus needed him, took advantage of the opportunity when it arose, and he gave Jesus what he had, although it was not much. And then here's the third thing, generosity. Proximity, he was close to Jesus when Jesus needed him. Opportunity, when the need arose, he gave what he had, though it wasn't much, and that's the third point, generosity. The disciples who should be the heroes of the story because they'd been with Jesus daily. The disciples had a lot more than this little boy had. Philip spilled the beans and said, Jesus, we've got 8 months' wages in the coffers. But you notice the one thing Philip didn't do was give what he had. He didn't say, may not be enough, but here it is. He had it in his hands, but he didn't let it go. The little boy, on the other hand, had almost nothing. But what he had, he gave. I've noticed over the years, reading through the Bible, I don't know if it's always true, I'll say it is almost always true, and maybe always true, that the context for miracles is sacrifice. There is almost always someone who gives something, and it becomes the soil in which a miracle is produced. The little boy had almost nothing compared to the great problem at hand, but what he had, he gave. And what I find so fascinating about this story from God's point of view is that God chose to work through a little boy and his small lunch than to work through a group of disciples and their 8 months' wages. And I have noticed that that tends to be true, that God usually chooses to work through the person who has less, if they will give what they have. It may be less talent, it may be less money, whatever it is, skills, resources, money, God works through the person who has less when he lets it go so that God will be glorified. Yesterday, December 8th, was the 1-year anniversary of the death of my dear friend Don Overstreet. You folks remember Don, who would come here to preach, raising money for his organization, LA Reaching LA. Don, and I wrote something on Facebook about this yesterday on the anniversary of Don's death. Don is, without exception, the greatest missionary I have ever known. I'm talking about overseas, with the Foreign Mission Board, here in the California Baptist Convention, bar none, the greatest missionary I've ever known. Now, another thing I'll tell you about Don is that Don was an exceptionally ordinary person. He had 2 years of pastoral experience, which is the minimum amount you needed to get accepted by the Foreign Mission Board. And he got that 2 years in just under the belt because they fired him. They pulled him aside one day and said to him, son, you just can't preach. And we need somebody here who can preach. He was not, a genius, although he had a genius about missions and things, but it wasn't that he was exceptionally smart. He was not, I don't know of any particular talent that he had outside of the ministry. He was not athletic, he didn't play an instrument, he didn't sing. He was not a great student, an average student. An average person in every way you can think of, except that extraordinary ability to be completely sold out to the Lord and to just give everything he had to God. I know hundreds of ministers who were smarter than him, more gifted than him, better preachers, more degrees, all of it. I've never known anybody so completely sold out to the Lord. This little boy had next to nothing, but in generosity he let go of what he had. Philip was thinking like a rational adult. There's nothing wrong with that. But he looked at the problem, he looked at the resource, and he said, geez, I don't think it can be done. The little boy was thinking like a child, right? He just came to Jesus and held out his hands with that lunch and just said, here it is. It didn't occur to him it wasn't possible. In fact, he was right. It was not impossible. It was possible with God. Time and time again, both as churches and individuals, God puts us in situations where we are under-resourced. so that we'll depend on him. This little boy who said yes, he was close by when Jesus needed him. The need for food was the opportunity for him to give what he had. And in generosity, he gave what he had. Proximity, opportunity, generosity. God tells us to let go of what we have. He'll do the rest. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this great reminder from your word that with you all things are possible. Help us to do our part in faith and to trust you for the rest. And we give thanks today for this example from this wonderful little boy who had almost nothing but gave you what he had. We pray this in Jesus' name.